So we are on chapter 27 of your world history, section 3, the continuing threat of communism. We're going to be talking about Russia after the Cold War and the rise of China, onto North Korea, Africa, South Africa, and Cuban strongholds of communism. See this picture here? We have, is this tomorrow? A picture of communism here. As communism coming to America, and on to the threat to freedom, and how communist countries, one of the biggest persecutors, Marxist terrorists are one of the biggest persecutors of Christians. So let's begin. Russia after the Cold War. We have President Boris Yeltsin emerging as the most powerful man in Russia after the coup. They basically got rid of Gorbachev, So now comes Boris Yeltsin. What is he going to do? Well, he made it clear that the breakup of the Soviet Union did not mean that the Soviet republics had complete autonomy, basically thinking Russia still has control of them, even though they claim to be independent. Russian troops were sent to Georgia and Moldova, and despite objections, they were also sent to the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So basically, Yeltsin now is sending Soviet troops into these countries to try to gain back control of them. So Russian troops were also fought in Tajikistan against groups seeking autonomy. In Tajikistan, they wanted to get away from Russia. So Yeltsin sent in troops again. So what is happening? After the fall of the Soviet Union, we have Yeltsin wanting to still have control of some of these countries that declared independence. Yeltsin crushes opposition. Members of the Russian parliament and cabinet began to resent Yeltsin and his dictatorship power, or dictatorial power, right? So on September 21st, 1993, Yeltsin decided to quell his opposition by dissolving the parliament and calling for new elections. So violent demonstrations happened, and Yeltsin called for the military police to come in. Anti-Yeltsin leaders barricaded themselves within the Russian parliament and called upon the military to back them up. But Yeltsin had loyalty of most of the military, insisting on the domination of the Commonwealth of Independent States. That's what Russia was called now, the Commonwealth of Independent States. So tanks fired on the Parliament building. Rebels were rounded up and sent to prison. This was called Black October. 100 dead bodies were cleared from the rubble in the streets of Moscow. So wow, we still have turmoil. Now against President Yeltsin, who's wanting to become a dictator. In fact, getting away from the parliament and dissolving the parliament and having not free elections, going back to a more dictator control over as was before. So here you can see what has happened on this Black October. A lot of unrest in Russia. Brutality in Chechnya. So Yeltsin sponsored a new Russian constitution now, giving the presidency vast powers. That means he would have most of the power, while limiting the regional assemblies, basically giving the government there his power over all of their regions, right? So more power in the central government. In 1994, he sent 40,000 troops to the Descendant Republic of Chechnya in the Caucasus Mountains. He wanted to crush their independent movement, and he sent them to brutally crush it. So there was a full-scale assault of the capital of Grozny, and it resulted in hundreds of civilian deaths. But the Chechens fought on. The West condemned the Russian atrocities they were doing in Chechnya. Yeltsin insisted the right to preserve the territory's integrity of Russia, basically saying Chechnya has no right to try to become independent. And so he said, we can do what we want. So attacking that area. He warned that any opposition to his government could result in the rise of a far worse regime, saying, okay, if Chechnya does not surrender, then there's going to be worse things happening, he threatened. So we have crazy things going on in Russia now, even after the Cold War. Vladimir Putin in 2000 and Medvedev also. Putin was appointed by Yeltsin to be his successor. Under Putin, many of the Russians' new freedoms were reversed. He started taking away the freedoms that they had given to the Russian people. Russian television stations and media came back under the control of the state and broadcasted propaganda during the election cycles. Putin selected Dmitry Medvedev as his protege to follow him in office. And then Putin then became prime minister of Russia. Although Medvedev was elected to office March 2nd, 2008, in what was another undemocratic election, Putin still controlled most of the power. So, in Russia, we had Yeltsin on, now we have Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was with the KGB, so it basically looks like Putin, even today, Putin's in charge, and it looks like Putin was going back to some of the old Soviet ways. Even after the Soviet system fell and communism, the Cold War, came to an end, but did it really? I know I've been to Russia 17 times in this time, and you can see now, even now going there, how a lot of the freedoms that were, especially the freedom to give the gospel, is not there anymore. The rise of China. After the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, China, along with North Korea and Cuba, continued to be communist states. China became a prominent nation with phenomenal economic growth at the turn of the century. By inviting other nations to set up companies in their country, as well as encouraging direct foreign investment, China got more involved in the international trade. China continued its policies of allowing more market and economic reforms, but at the same time was suppressing politically and religious freedom. So here we have China allowing markets, allowing their economy, trying to bring in more companies, trying to get into foreign trade, but they were taking away the freedoms of their people politically and their religious freedoms. Did not have religious freedoms in China. China being that atheist type country. Atheist dictators. Deng Xiaoping, his plan of his modernizations. 4 modernizations in China were aimed at the improvements in industry, military, technology, and agriculture. Those 4 things. Economic progress was high in the agenda of Deng's successors, too. And China's successes in economy masked their other problems, though. such as the communist suppression of political freedom. So here China, as they're trying to say, okay, we're going to modernize in farming, industry, science and technology, and defense and these things, as you can see, but still they were suppressing the freedoms of the people, politically and religiously. Persecution and limiting freedom in China. The Communist Party limited the freedoms of the people. They suppressed the People's Democratic Party and opposed the Dalai Lama too. Christians continued to be harassed by party officials constantly. It is estimated that over 2,000 pastors were jailed between 2005 and 2006. They were jailing the Christian pastors. Many Christians were killed in China throughout its history. China expands its military. China moved from a purely defensive approach to a more offensive posture. That means before they were just defending themselves, but now they were looking to be a world leader militarily. In 2007, China launched a missile that destroyed the old Chinese satellite orbiting the Earth. Such technology would be devastating if it was used as an act of aggression. Much of the Western communications and military communications is dependent on satellites. So what was happening here? In 2007, they launched a missile and they destroyed one of their old Chinese satellites up there, and people looked on, other countries looked on and say, wow, China does have the power to destroy a missile above the Earth. What could they do to us, right? And of course, much of the Western communications and the military communications are dependent on satellites. Maybe China will want to destroy our satellites. Just seeing this power made the world look and say, okay, we must be careful with China, at least they thought. And on to North Korea. After World War II, North Korea was ruled by communist dictator Kim Il-sung, who lived in 1948 to 1994. Kim Il-sung's regime had been heavily supported by the Soviet Union and China. But this began to change in the 1960s, making them more isolated, where China and the Soviet Union weren't really involved so much. Kim Jong-il succeeded him after his death in 1994. That was with his son. And then North Korea became the only communist dynasty. When you say dynasty, it means that it was passed on by heritage from fathers to sons, right? So now we have a communist dynasty in North Korea. After his father died, Kim Jong-il changed the calendar in North Korea so that year 1 was the year of his father's birth. So you can see what kind of dictator he was, saying, everyone, the year of my father's birth is going to be year 1, and you're going to do exactly what we say. Horrible dictator who murdered many, all of the fathers and the sons as we go down the line in North Korea, and how they oppressed their own people terribly. North Korea's famine and disease. During the 1990s, an estimated 5% of North Koreans starved to death. Can you imagine that? 5%. At one point in 1996, the government ration for a single person was 7 ounces of cereal per day. That's all they got to eat, was 7 ounces of cereal weighed out. That was their food. Reports of cannibalism even became prominent as people died. How terrible. While North Koreans starved, Kim Jong-il continued to build nuclear weapons. That's where he was spending his money. the money of the country and the money of the people. This alarmed neighboring South Korea and Japan, especially because they're close enough, thinking, well, they could launch a nuclear war against us. And his son, Kim Jong-un, was successor, continued the communist dynasty, whose aggressive actions are a growing concern for nations around the world. So we have this dynasty here of North Korea, that have been terrible to their own people, even allow them much famine and disease, and not dealing with this. But you have them focusing on nuclear weapons and living huge, extravagant lifestyles. So on to Africa. So I'm going to stop there and do Africa in the next video.